I'm here in Burlington, Ontario, and Garth is with us from Ottawa, Ontario, and we will be leading the webinar together this afternoon. This webinar is being recorded, so if you know of someone who wasn't able to be with us today or someone who would benefit from hearing the information that Garth has to share with us, you will have access to the recording approximately a week following the webinar. Today's webinar is the last webinar of the fall. We do have a lineup for starting in January, a couple of webinars scheduled, and the information to register will be available soon. But just to give you a heads up, the first one will be on Tuesday, January the 14th, and it's a 50-minute retreat. We felt that having a time to pause and reconnect at the start of a new year would be a good and exciting opportunity, and also to do that in the context of the online community with one another. So do stay tuned for that. Following the webinar this afternoon, we invite you to fill out our feedback polls. They just take a few minutes, but help give us a sense of what you appreciate and value about the webinar experience so that we can continue to offer good quality webinars for people in the future. So today Garth is going to lead our conversation, and Garth and I have agreed to make this a little bit more interactive than some of our webinars are, and so we really encourage your questions, your comments, and to do that you'll type them into the chat pod below, as many are already doing. So you'll see at the bottom, for those who are new, underneath the two videos of Garth and myself is the chat pod. Simply click the white bar at the bottom of that pod, type your question or comment in, and then click enter or the button to the right. So Garth and I will be stopping at various points, and I will raise your questions in a conversational style with Garth at that time. Garth has also made his PowerPoint available, and you can find that underneath the PowerPoint that you see on the screen. You'll see a little box that says Files and the title of the file, Garth Mundle. If you click and highlight that and then click Download File, you'll have access to his PowerPoint on your computer. So finally, and last but not least, we are happy, Garth, to have you with us today. Garth is a native of Pugwash, Nova Scotia, currently in Ottawa, as I mentioned. Garth was ordained in the Maritimes and completed his graduate work at Andover Newton and Boston University. He spent several exciting sabbatical periods, 1 year on the road, a second sabbatical in Central America and Israel, Palestine, and a third doing management and planning work for hospitals in India. So a wide breadth of experience. Currently, Garth is focusing on new church development and intentional interim ministry and helping groups of congregations explore new ways of being church. So a very relevant topic for today, and we're glad to have you with us, Garth.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Most of what's happened in my life has been by happenstance more than planning. So I've been involved in a great many different aspects of church life, and it's not been a plan kind of thing, and that's how this came about, the using of quantum principles in leadership. And it's not my intention to try to familiarize everybody with the principles of quantum physics. Principles of quantum leadership no more state the whole story about leadership than quantum physics is the whole story about physics. So I want to make that clear at the outset, that this is one possible resource for leadership, but it's not the whole story. But it's one that I found both exciting and helpful and interesting, and I've often been heard to say that I wish that I had discovered this 40 years ago. It would have helped me in my work and ministry in the church, and saved me some grief, by the way. Now I'm going to run down some of the technicalities, I suppose, or the sort of the basis for how I got started working with congregations and using quantum principles. And so I've got to remember to keep moving my PowerPoint here so that you will be able to see what I'm talking about. Now, the first thing, in terms of what I've been doing recently in the last few years, is to get an agreement with Presbytery that they will suspend all presbytery requirements and policy and procedures that are laid down in the manual for while the project is being operated. And I found that to be critical in terms of transfer of power. The presbytery is in effect saying all their power will revert to the working group while the project is underway. Now, this is, I found that, they have to take a deep breath when you say the presbytery. I sit down with them. Usually I'm accompanied by one or two people from the congregation that wants me to work with them. And we go to the presbytery and we say, now here's one of the conditions for going ahead with this project, is that you have to suspend your authority over this project for a while its duration. And they're reassured that whatever proposals or models are developed, they'll come to the presbytery eventually for approval. But while the project is in operation, presbytery's hands off completely. And I've found that that's critical in order for the working group, I'll talk about that in a minute, for that working group in order to embrace the power that's offered to them. And as a faculty member from United College in Montreal said at one place I was making a presentation, said to me, well, what you're doing is you're giving the power to the people, and you'll discover most of the time, while they talk about wanting the power, in reality they don't want it, because to take the power creates a certain level of anxiety. So that's the first thing, in terms of my experience, was to say to the presbytery, you're out of this until such time as they come out with proposals or models. Then the second thing is to get a covenant with the congregations that are going to participate. So the congregations are invited by the presbytery to send people to come to a meeting where I outline the basis of how this is going to operate, which is that they will appoint, elect, it doesn't matter how they go about it, but they will appoint or elect or have representatives who will sit on a working group. And that from that point on, the congregation must be committed to see this through to its conclusion, no matter what. If it's abandoned in the middle, or if it comes up with some proposal in the end, it will come back to them. But in the interim, the congregation has to be prepared to stick with the process. No backing out. I outline how it's going to operate and the principles under which it will operate, so they have some idea, and you'll see in a minute why they have problems with that, but they're in it for the duration. And their delegates or representatives and the alternatives, or the alternates, I guess you call it, who will come, have to understand that. So then that's outlined with congregations, and they go back and decide whether or not they want to be a part of this. And if some have doubts and didn't understand what's going on, I'm quite prepared to go and have a meeting with the congregation and outline it. Now, I can think of one instance where I did this, and one of the congregations said, no, we don't think we want to do this. And then when I met with them, I went all over it again with more people from that congregation alone, and then they said, no, this is too uncertain. You've got no process. You have no pattern here. You have no goals. How do we know what we're getting in for? And I said, well, you don't. Under quantum principles, it's like the universe unfolding. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, much less next week. And they couldn't cope with this. And we made repeated efforts to make them aware of how it worked. And I had a meeting with their clergy person. But in the end, they were looking for a pattern or a program or a model, or what would you call it, where you get laid down, this is how it's going to happen, and this is what the outcome will be, and this is what the goal is going to be. And you can't answer any of those questions using quantum principles. So they chose not to be part of it, which of course disappointed the other congregations who are in that same region. But that's the way it works. It's up to you. You have the power, and it's up to you to use that power to decide if you're going to participate or not participate. No persuasion. This is the way it works. So that's the covenant with the congregations. Then when the congregation has appointed or elected or whatever their representatives, then you have the working group. And the first group task, of course, for the working group is for me to make them familiar with quantum principles. And that takes time. Now, my role as the facilitator or the consultant, whatever you want to call me, is I don't have any plan. I don't have any set method for them to work with. And of course, this is, of course, rather disturbing news. And the second thing that we have to get clearly established, you are not here to act in the interests of your own congregation. That's not why you're here. You have the responsibility, like a bishop, for making decisions about this collection, or whatever you want to call it, this area of congregations. And you're going to make decisions, come up with some model, some proposal for what to do with this group of congregations. And you're not here just to simply find out how your own is going to survive or how it's going to make changes. You have to function here like a bishop. And if you're just here to be interested in your own congregation, well, then there's the door, because you'll be no use to us in this project. We're all on the same page, working to make a decision, just like the bishop might have to make a decision about what he or she is going to do with this group of congregations. My job is to help familiarize you with quantum principles that we will use in order to arrive either at some model or some proposal, or at a decision that nothing can be done at this time in this situation. And I'm not here when I don't have any answers, and I don't have any proposal from the presbytery or from anybody else for that matter. And any experience I've had before with models, we can't transfer here. You're going to come up with a model or a proposal of your own that fits this situation. Then there's two other pieces that come in here. It's sort of this building the structure, I guess you'd call it. One is that I invite the presbytery, if they wish, to appoint a committee or a group who I will meet with periodically to keep them apprised of what's going on with this particular project and get any feedback that they might want to bring to me. And then also in the working group itself, now we're with the working group, those representatives in the congregation, they usually select a couple of coordinators who will look after scheduling the meeting, making sure we have a place to meet, providing refreshments, whatever, the mechanics of the situation, so that I don't have anything to do with that, because the group has no structure itself. There's not going to be a chair or a secretary or any of that. This is one group working like one being, one voice. Now, the other thing here that usually causes a wrinkle or two, or somebody to suck in their breath, is that the clergy are not part of the working group. Now, you can debate that and make a decision yourself. But one of my criteria is, and conditions, is that the clergy people will not be part of the working group. Now, in one instance, I periodically met with the clergy who were involved, their congregations. That is, if the congregations involved, I'd meet with them periodically, because it may mean that they'll end up without jobs. And that can be a very threatening kind of situation, or confusing. In other instances, either they weren't interested or whatever the group decided, I didn't meet with the clergy at all. Now, the clergy committed to the process at a later date, but not at the outset. So that pretty much covers sort of getting started or laying the groundwork. Oh, I have to remember that I don't hit. I have to go back on the screen. Now, have we got any questions around that so far, or reactions?
Well, Garth, I do have a question, and I invite others to type their questions into the chat pod, and we can engage back and forth with Garth. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about quantum principles, where that started for you, how that relates, how it informs your work with congregations.
Quantum theory is difficult. I've forgotten who one of the creators said at one time, if you think you understand it, you don't know what it's all about, because in some sense it's almost incomprehensible. But it is universally now accepted by the scientific world that quantum principles are the basis on which the universe operates on the micro level. Now, on the macro level, we're still operating very much as we always did, what I call the modern era, or the Enlightenment, that we were all trained in. We're all shaped by it. The university was dominated by it. It's A plus B will get you C. Now, in reality, what's been discovered through quantum physics is that A plus B gets you what you think is C, but it isn't actually the total reality. So that's, in essence, the basis for quantum physics. Or another way of putting it is to say, talking about light, is light a particle or a wave? And the answer to be now would be yes. It's both and. That's an oversimplification. And I don't even pretend to be an expert in quantum physics, but I know enough about it to be able to have taken the principles and applied them to leadership. Now, somebody else, I have the book up there on the shelf, I looked it up today, who I discovered, I've been at this for quite a long time. Margaret Wheatley wrote a book entitled Leadership and the New Science. Leadership and the New Science. Now, she didn't write it specifically for churches. You can apply these principles anywhere where you're trying to make decisions and plan and do that kind of thing. I got involved in it largely because a professor who never taught me, but he was at the Andover Newton Theological School. Some years after I had left there, I noticed an article in some journal that he was saying, we're preaching the same old story, meaning the gospel story, but he said the difficulty is we're preaching it with an old understanding of the universe. And I'll never forget reading that small paragraph and thinking, that's right. We're still operating as though it was the old understanding of the universe, the Newtonian. And that got me interested. And then I began to dig and think about it and read about it, and eventually ended up teaching a course on science and religion. And by that time, I was well into understanding the principles of quantum physics, or at least the changes that a quantum understanding of the universe necessitates. It's a complete change of the way we think. And that's one of the first tasks I had to undertake, or have to undertake when I'm doing it, with working groups, is to get them out of that old box. That takes time. I work at that usually once a week for at least 3 weeks. Sometimes it's longer before they get the basic idea that, no, we're not operating on those principles anymore. And then eventually, by using them, of course, people get familiar with them, and then they get so they can say to each other, when something is being discussed, somebody will say to somebody else, no, that's the old understanding of how we operate. We have a new understanding of how the universe operates. And since we're part of the universe, it's helpful to be operating in concert with the universe. Or if you prefer a theological interpretation, you can say, well, this is the way God works, and it's better that we should work the way God works.
Well, that's very interesting and important for the church to understand the context in which we're working, and the differences between models of ministry that worked and philosophies undergirding those models that worked in the past, and now as we move to the future, how that looks different, and how that can inform our working with others. I want to a little bit of a time like here. I want to shift a little bit to some moving towards some more practical questions that people have asked, and I'm going to raise Nancy's first. She asks who might initiate this working group of congregations, and then I think that'll provide a good lead into Judy's question. But how does this start? Do congregations approach you? How does that process take place?
So in this context, the very first time I was approached by the conference person, the executive secretary, or whatever the title is for the person who's responsible for the congregations in the conference. And we had arrived in Ottawa, and somehow she got wind of what I'd been doing or what we'd been doing, and she approached me and said, we need somebody who will work with these congregations. And you can sort of write your own ticket. And so that's how it got started. And then I think the presbytery or the conference invited the congregations to meet. In the most recent issue, I'm trying to think what happened in West Quebec. I think the presbytery approached me. No, they set up a meeting. The presbytery set up a meeting of these congregations and invited me to come and talk about this process. And then the congregations had to make a decision whether or not they were going to participate. And as I told you, that was one instance in which one congregation decided not to. So that's it. But you could initiate it anyway. There's no template. It could be one clergy person or one lay person saying to 3 congregations, do you want to try something different? Or do you want to try to work on what your situation is? Or there's another option. Or have you heard of the Genesis Project? It can't be transferred, but do you want to try something similar? Or do you want to find out how this operates? So anybody could initiate it.
Yes, and we have a couple of questions from Judy. Thanks for that, Garth. Asking about more practically the ideal size of the working group, and it's interesting given our conversation about the fluidity and the unfolding nature and the lack of a strict template that you have as you work with congregations. But we do have these practical realities. So in your experience, is there an ideal size of working group? Judy wonders whether perhaps 2 people from each congregation, say there are 4 or 5 that are involved. Would that be about right, or does it vary?
Shaped in our thinking. Again, it doesn't matter. You could have any number, whatever emerges. One working group I had was about, I think there were 15, and then they had alternates who would fill in because somebody has to be there every time. It's not a come when you can sort of thing. Be present unless you're dead or dying. Of course, we're all dying one way or another, but be present regardless. And if you're not there, your alternate must be there. I've had groups 15. I've had them 22, but I've worked in 2 groups. One had 160 in it. And then we had one meeting in the Dundas Presbytery area, which I might talk about later if we have time, where we had over 800 people show up. You can use the principles regardless of the size of the group. You could use them in your own reflections, in fact. And I need to talk more about those because all I've talked about so far in terms of quantum is how I got into it and got involved and became familiar with it, at least to a degree that I could use it. So any size of group that you want, doesn't matter.
It sounds a little bit like discerning the flow of spirit and
That's right. And
working with God as God works in
no
many different ways in
That's
different
one of the
contexts.
difficult things about using quantum principles is that we are always, out of our anxiety, which is perfectly normal, we are always trying to get some degree of certainty, and there isn't any certainty. There are only possibilities, and the possibilities are infinite. And that also creates a certain level of anxiety. So it's really important, in my experience, now I'm not saying my experience by any means is the only one, in my experience, to get people thoroughly familiar and comfortable with the quantum principles. And then they're more, they find it easier to operate with them. But that was the second. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, back to your experience with congregations, again, recognizing how various this can be. The congregations that you worked with, have they been so small? Have they been small? Have they been on the verge of closing? At what point in the cycle have they realized they need to make changes, work with others?
They were small.
Maybe you can share a little bit about your own experience.
And I heard the moderator here. He was in Ottawa here the other day, and he's talking about what percentage of our congregations in the United Church are small rural congregations. It was really startling. I knew it, but it needed to be reminded, 70-some%. So in two instances, they were very small. But in most of these groups, they would vary. I'm thinking one particular group that I just worked with in West Quebec, that, by the way, is doing very well. The largest congregation had an average of about 30 to 40 on a Sunday. And the smallest one had about 5 represented in that group. But then I think of the Seaway Valley, where there were anywhere from small congregations to congregations like that could be the biggest United Church in Cornwall. And so those would be much larger congregations. So it varies in terms of size. And sometimes, and that's very good too, in the sense that I find, again, that using quantum principles works well when you have to work with very small congregations and big congregations together. You get out of that trap of the big ones trying to lord it over the smaller ones, or the smaller ones being so anxious about being taken over by the big ones that they can't even think straight, and it dominates their thinking, because everybody's going to operate on quantum principles, and all the old principles of numbers and amounts don't count for anything, which keeps them from talking about money and finances and who's got how much and who's got an endowment fund and who hasn't. Not relevant. Not relevant. Which, of course, is a new thought for most people, because that's where they spend a lot of their time. Because that belongs. Go ahead.
And most of the congregations, Garth, have they been on the verge of closing, or have some initiated this process when they're still a little bit more healthy and vibrant?
Find out what they're going to do in a rapidly changing cultural context. They're aware that things are not going to stay the way they are, because that's the way the universe operates. That's everyone. Theologically, that's the way God operates. And so you better get with the program. So there are congregations, like after I did, I think it was the Genesis Project in Seaway Valley, the Presbytery decided they wanted all the congregations in the whole of the Seaway Valley to be introduced to this process. So all the congregations, I don't know, there must have been 38 or I can't remember. So there were all kinds of congregations that were nowhere near the way on the road to closure. There were some that were, but I think the congregations that participated, and I don't think there were any that didn't, were congregations who were looking around themselves in the world and saying, the foundation is shifting, the sea is changing, we're in a very different, rapidly shifting context than what we have ever been. And I can certainly say that, having been in the business for 50-some years. It's nothing like even what I was experiencing at the time I was at St. Stephen's College. It's changed that much. So there are congregations who are not dying, but they recognize tomorrow's not going to be the same as today, much less yesterday.
Okay, I'm recognizing, Garth, that you have some more material to share with us, and I think your next piece is on quantum principles, which you've already talked about a little bit. Perhaps you have more to add. Still a couple of questions. One of them is on specific examples of your work with congregations, and I know you've shared bits of that already. So perhaps you can think of example, a particular example of work that you've done and how that went, what the benefits were for the congregation, what were the challenges.
The danger is that
maybe
I'll
you
get
can,
sucked back
don't know if that will fit with your
old
next
modus
section,
operandi.
but if there's anything more on quantum principles
and I don't want to do that.
specific
and I'll
examples,
talk
that
about
would be
a couple
great.
of situations when I get near the end, if I can, okay? So the first thing is to get people out of the modern era box, the way we've been trained to think, that A plus B equals C, and that we'll get there if we get the A's and the B's together. So we'll have an amalgamation, or we'll have some new thing if we get all the data and we get it arranged in the right way. And there must be some solution to this problem. And I often say, you waste your time trying to solve problems. You just endure them till something new emerges. So to get people out of that kind of box of thinking is, in my way of thinking, the most important segment of this process. And to have people understand that that way of thinking is not the way the universe, or the way, if you want to, God operates. That there are no certainties and there are no guarantees, and we waste our time looking for them. Don't declare goals at the outset. You have no idea what the goal of the universe is for your life tomorrow, let alone next week. And so when we're trying to set goals and say, well, we're going to do this and do that, on the macro level, yes, I'm not saying that I lived my whole life like a fool in paradise. But in terms of setting goals, we often set goals and then try to make our way toward them. And with this process, you don't do that. We think in terms, to think quantumly is to think in terms of infinite possibilities. So you take a group of small congregations, and they're thinking only of survival, or what are we going to do, and they're desperate with this. And the first thing I say to them is, you've got to start thinking in terms of the possibilities here are infinite. At this point, you can't even imagine what they might be. And we're not talking about getting more bums in the pews or nickels and noses. We have no idea what the possibilities are. We're going to use these principles. We're going to try to operate here the way the universe operates, and watch for what emerges, and decide then if you're prepared to act on what emerges. Now, to get people to think in those terms, it's not easy. It's not a Saturday morning job, because they'll all be thinking in terms of how do we get more people, or how do we get more money. And there's, as you know, there's an infinite number of programs that tell people how to revitalize the church, and how to get more money, and how to get more people. And how to get more youth. And all that. And most of them, as we say, 75% of them, according to our research, end up failing. And they're not very exciting, and they're sometimes very depressing, and sometimes they are exciting. So we talk in terms, we don't know what the possibilities, so people say, well, what are the possibilities, Mundle? I say, I don't know. I don't know what God's going to do tomorrow, let alone to know what the possibilities are. They will emerge as we live and work our way through the possibilities, and they will emerge, and then we have to decide, or you have to decide, whether you're going to act on them or not. And if you don't act, nothing will happen. And I'll get paid whether you act or not. That two other things that you're all familiar with, the idea of chaos. We talk about it all the time, but then we're always trying to get rid of it or somehow manage it or organize it or what have you. Chaos, if we don't have chaos, we're not in concert with the universe. So we need to be in chaos, and the working group will sometimes be in chaos, and people will say, we're going nowhere, this is taking forever, and we're accomplishing nothing. And I say, yes, that's true. Our understanding of the universe is that it takes a very long time. We talk so piously about the wheels of God grinding slowly. Well, now you're finding out how slowly they really grind. That's the way the universe operates. And also the universe is a very chaotic place. And so if we're in chaos, we're in concert with the universe. We're working the way, quote, to put it theologically, the way God works. And that helps them to cope with that. And then another principle is, of course, in quantums, is that the universe is changing constantly, hourly, all the time. And if we are going to be in concert with the universe or in concert with God, we need to be changing. And we need to be alert to change and working with change and in sync with change. And so you get over that initial obstacle where, oh, people don't want to change and they have such trouble with change. Well, then I say they have an argument with God. Change is part of the universe. And if you're going to be in sync with the universe and in sync with God, you better be ready for change and working with change. So you've got to get those principles well established in people's minds before you can proceed any further. I don't know whether I'm confusing you or not. Some people say, oh, it's so confusing. I can't make head nor tails of it. Exactly. We can't make head nor tails of the universe either. We're just working away at it. Now, have we got any questions or reactions up to this point?
Well, Garth, we do have one from something you mentioned earlier. So back to the practical again. Regarding the involvement of clergy and the question is, so if a team of clergy initiate the exploration and arrange the commitment of the congregations, in your opinion, should the clergy remove themselves once the process gets going? If a team of clergy initiate the exploration and arrange the commitment of the congregation, so if it's clergy initiated, should the clergy remove themselves once the process gets underway?
On my experience, my guess would be yes. My reason for not having the clergy is probably as much psychological as it is theological. The difficulty with the clergy being present, even if they sit there and don't say anything, probably even more so if they don't say anything, their presence changes the dynamic. It's like having mama or papa present. It's like having the parent present, and or the executive of the presbytery. And no matter what happens in that dynamic, people are going to be influenced by that presence. It's going to drain off. If you you will, some of the power that's got to stay with the people. They'll be looking for approval. They'll be looking for support. They'll be looking for whatever they look to. Their clergy folk. So that's my reason for not having the power must be with that group. Your bishop, I keep telling them all this. I'm not a very good image of bishop, but the way bishop want to operate nowadays. But it's you. It's not me. It's not the presbytery. It's not anybody. So that's my reason for not having the courage of present at this point. Now, later on down the road, the clergy came into the process. But not at that point. So you'd have to make that decision. You have a conversation. Clergy should have a conversation among themselves. And see what emerges. Never mind the A+B, just sit down and have a conversation. just talk about everything and anything that might relate to this whole issue. And see what emerges. And the possibility these are infinite. There may be a whole range of possibilities. And then you decide which one you're going to act on. And as soon as you act on it, the other possibilities will tend to disappear, and others will emerge, which of course is one of the principles of quantum physics. As soon as you act on a possibility, as soon as you take an action, then that starts something else in motion, and some other possibilities disappear. It's the old, is a light a particle or a wave? I don't. If you know anything about quantum physics, you'll understand that principle. So I'd say, have a conversation, see what emerges, then act. And you might go, sorry.
And I think if clergy are able to hold back, at least initially in the process, that can allow a space for creativity and to see, as you say, what emerges, and for ownership by other leaders, by other emerging leaders.